is where freedom rings.
If you believe in America, if you believe in the Constitution empowers us. It's a new day. America's back. America's back, and America's going to get strong again. We're going to defend America, and we're going to defend our interests.
Liberty's voice, Levin TV.
Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Levin TV on CRTV.com. Well, all right. Now let's get into what I prepared to talk about. The president, North Korea, the summit. But the dark cloud that hangs over this, at least for me, is Red China. We always have to be mindful of what does China get out of these things? And we've done a number of shows on North Korea, Venezuela, Russia, and especially China, the buildup of its military, the stealing our technology, you name it. And so we want to circle back and take a look at this again, given this summit with North Korea, and given that North Korea is really a puppet state, at least for now, of Red China. First of all, who is Xi Jinping? You know, he came along, he had been a bureaucrat, sort of a mid-level bureaucrat, worked his way up into senior positions, and really, over the next 5, 6, 7 years, he works his way into a position where he can then consolidate power. He's now the most powerful dictator of China since Mao Zedong. That's a big deal, because China was going in the opposite direction, not into a Jeffersonian democracy mode, but much freer, much more open, and so forth. Xi has changed all of that. So who is he exactly? Let's take a look. Go.
China's President Xi Jinping is not as vocal or social media obsessed as President Trump, but he's arguably the world's most powerful leader, and thanks to a recent end to term limits, he can now rule for life. But few knew much about him before he became China's president. As a longtime cog in China's bureaucracy, Xi gave little indication of the sort of nationalist leader he'd be, until this comment he made as vice president.
吃饱了没事干的外国人呢，对我们的事情指手画脚。中国一不输出革命，二不输出饥饿和贫困，三不去折腾你们，还有什么好说的？
Those 30 seconds of shade were nearly entirely scrubbed from the interwebs by Chinese censors, but it did give the world a glimpse into how Xi might rule. Way before he was China's president, Xi Jinping couldn't even get into the Communist Party. He came from a well-off political family, but after his dad clashed with the party, he was turned away. As a teen, he lived in a remote village for several years, an experience some say helped him relate to Chinese citizens. He eventually joined the party, gradually moved up the ranks, and was appointed successor by party elders who thought he wouldn't shake things up. But that plan backfired. One of the signatures of his presidency has been a massive anti-corruption drive that punished nearly 300,000 politicians in 2016 alone. The corruption hunt has been both praised for its effectiveness and criticized as a ploy to root out Xi's political opponents.
这其中没有什么权力斗争，没有什么纸牌屋。
Stoking Chinese nationalism has been a big part of Xi's agenda, also known as the Chinese Dream, a term he made popular in 2013.
中国梦是历史的、现实的，也是未来的，是我们这一代人的，更是青年一代的。
That means becoming a global leader on several fronts, including the sciences, diplomacy, and culture. And parts of that dream seem to be paying off. Under Xi, China became the world's second largest economy, and its influence is only growing. His let's all win rhetoric about trade is especially pronounced in China's partnerships with countries in Eurasia, Latin America, and Africa.
中国人民深知实现国家繁荣富强的艰辛，中国人民张开双臂，欢迎各国人民搭乘中国发展的快车、便车。
A big part of achieving the Chinese dream is making sure all citizens are invested in what Xi calls harmony, that everyone is singing the same tune, so to speak, which explains why a 2017 law punishes anyone who distorts the lyrics or disrespects the national anthem. It's Xi's unifying philosophy that's allowed him to cement his status as the country's core leader, the highest honor for any Chinese ruler. He's built up a cult of personality, with appearances in his own propaganda cartoons and in mobile games. A recent popular game lets players compete over how fast they can clap for Xi. The app has registered over 1 billion claps. The government's online censors also carefully protect Xi's image. After news of lifting term limits hit, censors deleted critical social media comments and political memes of Winnie the Pooh, meant to represent Xi. China's government also uses state media to promote an image of unity. That's where the so-called 50 Cent Army comes in. They're the government's online foot soldiers who flood Chinese social media and forums with hundreds of millions of positive comments and stories a year. Chinese social media platforms make sure they don't ruffle any feathers. Weibo, China's version of Twitter, announced last September that it would hire 1,000 censorship supervisors. Shortly after, Freedom House named China the worst abuser of internet freedom for the second year in a row. The country's poor human rights record has been among one of the primary stains on its global image. Even so, everything seems to be in step with the vision Xi laid out last year at his party's 19th Congress. In that address, he laid out one of his most ambitious plans yet, transforming the armed forces. China is opening its first overseas military base in Djibouti and is increasing its presence in the South China Sea, both clear signs of its military expansion. With no successor and even more time to rule, Xi is getting closer to realizing the Chinese dream himself.
Yeah, the Chinese dream itself. We've seen these sort of things before, like in the 1930s, if you will. And we better be very, very mindful of what's going on here. The Pentagon fears that we, America, we're losing the hypersonic arms race with China and Russia. We have no defense against these weapons. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. And yet both Russia and China are full speed ahead. Let's take a look at this as well. Go ahead.
This is one of the most powerful and advanced weapons in the world. It's called a railgun, an electromagnetic, futuristic ship killer.
We concentrate electrical energy, create a magnetic force in an area about this big, and accelerate something to Mach 7.
But it may never leave this testing facility at the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Virginia. After more than 12 years in development, the Pentagon is considering stepping back from the program. But the railgun may have life elsewhere, like here, on a Chinese warship. According to the state-run People's Daily, this is China's railgun preparing for sea trials. Although there is some skepticism around the viability and even reality of this new weapon, the narrative China wants to convince the world of is clear. China is rapidly turning their military into a global power on par with the United States.
China feels very insecure in its position in Asia. It's surrounded by a number of major powers. Many are aligned with the United States, and it feels to protect its own sovereignty and advance its interests that it's going to need a world-class military of its own.
In April of 2017, China launched its second aircraft carrier, the first to be domestically built. In February, the Air Force announced that its newest stealth fighter, the J-20, is combat-ready. Hypersonic missiles and advanced cruise missiles are designed to take out an adversary's warship. China's modernizing their cyber, space, and electronic warfare groups, as well as their nuclear capabilities. And the government's controversial move to militarize reefs and atolls in the South China Sea has given it a strategic advantage in an area that produces billions of dollars from shipping, oil, and fishing. There are also concerns that China's authoritarian crackdown at home could spread as the country's economic and military influence grows. Washington is alarmed. The first national defense strategy in 10 years spells out the number one threat to American vital interests.
Great power competition, not terrorism, is now the primary focus of U.S. national security.
The defense strategy also claims that the U.S. military has atrophied, and the country's competitive military advantage has been eroding. The U.S. 7th Fleet is on the front lines of this new era of strategic competition. But recent events back up Secretary Mattis's claims. In 2017, 2 separate ship collisions killed 17 sailors. Both of the ship's captains were fired and are facing criminal charges, along with other officers, and both of the $2 billion destroyers are still out of commission. The fleet is also reeling from one of the worst corruption and bribery scandals in Navy history. As a result of the investigation, top officers, including admirals, are in jail, were fired, are awaiting trial, or have been disciplined.
The Navy's absolutely addressing the problems that they saw in the 7th Fleet. The question is really whether or not the changes they make are sufficient, whether or not the changes they make work, and whether or not the cultural changes that are probably necessary at this point actually take hold. Right now, the U.S. Navy is still way out front of the Chinese military in terms of what it can do, the sheer quantity of ships it has. The question becomes, what is the Chinese Navy doing to make advances?
According to a Defense Department report on China's military development, the country's officially disclosed military budget grew nearly 9% every year from 2007 to 2016.
I think there are elements to China's challenge that are threatening to the United States. Certainly if it seeks to drive the United States out of the region militarily, that's quite problematic. I think as current trends continue, if the Trump administration and the United States doesn't step up to the challenge, I think that's actually where we'll end up.
Boy, can you imagine being driven out of the area? The area includes Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines and a number of other countries, Vietnam, that whole South China Sea. You can look at it on a map yourself. I mean, that'd be an utter and complete disaster. And it happened, it seems like almost overnight, but it wasn't overnight. It started in the Obama administration, the degrading of our military, including the Navy. Under the Obama administration, so much damage. And President Trump's trying to address these things, trying to rebuild the United States military. And the very party that was involved in handicapping our military is the party that's involved in trying to obstruct his efforts. But there's more here. There's been a series of excellent articles in Bloomberg, believe it or not. First, we'll talk about China's master plan. And they had a series of 4 articles, and they have this month. From the East China Sea to Africa, Beijing is flexing its muscles. And it points out that for years, most experts believed that China's military challenge to the U.S. was regional in nature. It was confined to the Western Pacific. And after decades of tacitly free riding on America's global power projection capabilities, Beijing now is seeking the capabilities that will allow it to project its own military power well outside its regional neighborhood. The fact that China is building up its military strength is hardly news. The 1995-96 Taiwan Crisis, during which the U.S. responded to Chinese intimidation of Taiwan by sending 2 carrier groups to the area, underscored to the Chinese leadership that America's military dominance gave it the capability to intervene at will, even in China's own backyard. Still then, Beijing has been developing the capabilities, advanced fighter jets, anti-ship ballistic missiles, and stealthy diesel-electric attack submarines among them, meant not to just give it leverage over its East and Southeast Asian neighbors, but also to prevent the United States from intervening effectively in their defense. This effort to build what are known as anti-access area denial capabilities has borne fruit, and the U.S. will now face high and continually growing obstacles to defending Taiwan and other partners and allies, even in the event of conflict with China. Even as Beijing challenged U.S. dominance in the Western Pacific, it was simultaneously one of the greatest beneficiaries of America's global military superiority. U.S. power projection capabilities have underpinned the stability and freedom of the global commons and ensured the free flow of energy supplies and other key commodities. U.S. military power has thus fostered the relatively benign global climate in which China has grown rich and powerful. This is just one of the many paradoxes of the U.S.-China relationship. Washington has underwritten the economic rise of its greatest long-term strategic rival by protecting the global commercial flows that have made that rival so wealthy. China, for its part, has been a free rider on America's provision of global stability, even while challenging the U.S. ever more sharply in the Asia-Pacific. This situation could not last forever, though, because it represented a vulnerability that a rising China would not tolerate indefinitely. After all, if the U.S. can secure the global commons, then it can also dominate and even restrict access to them if it chooses to do so. U.S. strategists are also fully aware of this possibility, as proposals for a far seas blockade meant to starve Beijing of vital resources have figured prominently in the debate on how to defeat China in a possible war. Any great power would chafe at a situation in which its foremost rival has such enormous power over its own economic well-being, and China's no exception. So Bloomberg has done a good job of laying out some of the issues, and it is also doing a good job of giving passive excuses for the Chinese aggression that we are now facing and our allies are now facing. In another piece, the second of the fourth in the series, China's Master Plan, Exporting an Ideology. The 19th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in October 2017 is sure to loom large in future accounts of China's relations with the world. It was then that the party declared the way for Xi Jinping to rule indefinitely. And when Xi himself advertised China's global ambitions by declaring that Beijing would now take center stage in world affairs. It was also when Xi threw down the gauntlet in an equally consequential way. In his 3-hour speech to the assembled delegates, Xi extolled the virtues of Chinese authoritarian capitalism and offered Beijing as a model, quote, for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. Yes, including stealing from America. Xi's speech then was not simply an announcement of China's arrival on the global stage, it was a declaration of ideological competition, the starkest we have yet seen from Beijing against the U.S. and the democratic community it leads. Now, it goes on. He says Americans are used to thinking about China primarily as a challenge to U.S. global economic superiority and geopolitical primacy in the Asia-Pacific. What's become clear, though, is that the ideological challenge on authoritarian China poses to a democratic governance around the world is also quite serious. Many observers have been slow to recognize that challenge because any discussion of ideology is often dismissed as Cold War thinking, and because for so many years the free market democratic model appeared incontestably dominant. Yet China is contesting that dominance through a two-pronged offensive that involves promoting authoritarian governments while also undermining democratic practices in countries near and far. Well, it's not that China is such a great economic engine. It's stealing our proprietary information. It's stealing our technology through a variety of ways that we've talked about. China's ideological assertiveness has been building for years. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, pundits began arguing that the Beijing consensus, the mix of state-directed capitalism and authoritarian political control, was displacing a Washington consensus that had been badly tarnished by the near meltdown of global economy. A decade later, some projections have China on a path to dominating global GDP within half a century. Thus, it's little surprise that China's political economic model has long seemed attractive to developing countries, where economic growth is paramount and democratic institutions are often weak. Now, we make the case here that you cannot have a free economy without a free government, if you will, and you cannot have a free government without a free economy. And that still holds. This talk about capitalism in China is really odd. It's not really capitalism. It is an autocracy, and it uses its power. It uses its power to be corrupt and to steal other technologies and other information from other countries that are, and particularly our country and our corporations that are very, very successful. Now, this reminds me of a broader point, but obviously quite related, that I wrote about many years ago in Liberty and Tyranny. Those of you following along who have a copy, 1.5 million of you apparently, page 187. You see what China's doing, Russia, North Korea, Iran. And I pointed out then, the statist is and will be no more successful in his foreign policy promises than his domestic promises. I want you to think back to Barack Obama. I mean, it's really the last 10 years or so where China has taken off, and they have not been effectively challenged economically or militarily and prevented from stealing our technology and now stealing navigable waterways and so forth. International utopianism has no better chance than its domestic brand. For all his talk of America changing the world, the statist speaks not of American sovereignty, but of global citizenship. He speaks not of America as a nation-state, but as one nation among many. Rather than maintain its superpower status and act in its own best interest, the United States should relinquish its hard-earned position in favor of multilateral power sharing and conduct foreign policy, including decisions about military action in its own defense through coalitions and international organizations. I think I had Obama pegged. In this way, America's interests are subsumed and contained by the supposed interests of the whole. And the rest of the world will look approvingly upon the United States for empowering other countries to participate in decisions about America's survival. The statist seeks treaties not to preserve and improve American society, but to commit the United States to a course of conduct that cannot be easily reversed with the change of administrations. He will enter into treaties that include the Convention on the Rights of the Child, signed in 1995 but not ratified due to sovereignty and other concerns. The Convention on All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which the Senate has refused to ratify since Carter signed it in 1980. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, signed by Bill Clinton in 1996 but rejected by the Senate in 1999. The Kyoto Protocol on Climate Change, signed by Clinton in 1998 but never ratified, and Bush withdrew it in 2001. The Convention on the Law of the Sea, which would restrict U.S. commercial military operations by the Senate wouldn't take it up. And the International Criminal Court, which the United States has not joined. In each of these instances, decisions will be made through international bureaucracies that do not have as their moral imperative the preservation and improvement of American society. So while successive administrations, including the last one, were pursuing this dangerous notion of foreign policy utopianism, the Chinese, mentioned the Russians and others, were proceeding not with multilateral relations in that respect, but multilateral relations in terms of empowering themselves. America's adversaries and enemies do not consider themselves global citizens, nor are they constrained by international sensibilities and arrangements. Now, this is many years ago I wrote this. A resurgent Russia, an aggressive China, communist movements growing in Latin America, rogue regimes in North Korea and Iran, Islamic terrorism, to name a few, all reject the statist utopia as a weakness to be exploited. They're not motivated by world opinion, but by their own desires. They seek strategic, economic, and military advantage. For example, while China locks up oil contracts with countries in Africa and Latin America, and Russia lays claim to the North Pole to expand its access to crude oil, the statist asserts that America is only 5% of the world's population, but consumes 1/4 of the world's total energy supply, suggesting that America must become poorer so the rest of the world might become richer. And it goes on, or I go on, in Liberty and Tyranny. Now let's continue with China. Again, this is in the context of the summit with North Korea. We must at all times keep in mind that the puppet master for North Korea, at least right now, is China. A third piece in Bloomberg, China's master plan, a worldwide web of institutions. For decades following the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, Beijing was an international renegade that sat outside most established institutions. From the 70s onward, it gradually became a participant in, but not a leader of, global institutional architecture dominated by the United States and its allies. But now, Beijing is establishing its own rival institutions and using them as part of its broader effort to reshape the world to its advantage. It's easy to forget what a drastic break with the past this is. During the 50s and 60s, Mao Zedong's government was not even a member of the United Nations because of its dispute with Taiwan over which country was the rightful representative of China. After China began its opening to the world in the 70s, it gradually integrated into the international institutional order, joining the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, well, that was a joke, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, and other agreements and bodies. Yet even so, China largely declined a leadership role in these institutions. The second generation of Chinese leaders, Deng Xiaoping and his disciples, adhered to the dictum that China should hide its capabilities and bide its time. Some Chinese analysts even believe the U.S. calls for Beijing to become a responsible stakeholder in the international order were a trick to force China to exhaust itself by bearing the burdens of global leadership. Recently, though, Beijing's attitude has been changing. One reason is simply that the existing institutional landscape changed too slowly to accommodate its remarkable rise. Case in point, 2010, the IMF approved a change in its voting quotas meant to reflect China's increasing weight in the global economy. Yet implementation was delayed for more than 5 years because of the refusal of the United States Congress to ratify the change. In these circumstances, it was only natural for Chinese leaders, I like the way this guy lays out the issues, but I do not like the way he then puts in his liberal spin on behalf of China. It was only natural for Chinese leaders to begin wondering how well existing international institutions serve Beijing's interests and whether they might do better by striking out on their own. And it goes on. And then finally, in the series, the 4-part series, China's Master Plan, How the West Can Fight Back. The U.S. needs to protect sea lanes, push democracy, and most important, mend ties with its allies. All of this is in addition to the other more familiar aspects of the Chinese challenge: Beijing's efforts to overturn the military balance in the Western Pacific, its coercion of U.S. allies and partners, and its audacious plans to establish economic dominance in an array of critical sectors. American officials have known for many years that China would eventually be a force to reckon with in global politics, but how rapidly and expansively that change has emerged has nonetheless been striking. Again, it's not only due to what China has done to itself, by hook or by crook, but what the United States has done to itself, and that's what happens when you have a president like Barack Obama. So he points out how to deal with a China that is putting U.S. leadership and international order under stress on a variety of fronts at once. Well, it won't be easy, but neither should it be considered impossible. First, with respect to China's expanding military footprint, it's important to remember that this trend is not all bad, at least in the short run. A dollar that China spends on prestige capabilities such as vulnerable aircraft carriers is a dollar it may not be able to spend on the more lethal anti-access area denial capabilities that could give U.S. forces fits in the Western Pacific. Yet Washington still needs to be thinking, or begin to, about a future in which Beijing can create global dilemmas by projecting power outside the Western Pacific and so forth. All right, look. What he's trying to say, is we have to look at where China has projected its military and economic power, and we need to confront it. And you don't have to confront it militarily necessarily. You may have to, but you confront it strategically, and then you institute tactics that are intended to address them. Also, we need to strengthen our alliances, not weaken them. We need to convince our longtime allies to join with us in this regard. That's why it's important to have alliances. That's why it's important not to be complete protectionists. That's why it's important not to say, what, are we going to be the policemen of the world? Well, we don't want to be the suckers and the prisoners of the world, do we? So that requires the ability to have military power and other power well beyond our borders. And you do that through alliances, you do that through military bases, you do that through economic relationships, you do it through those things that we've done best over the decades, over really more than a century, in order to ensure our superpower status. And we need to ensure our superpower status given the threats that are arising out there. Now, how China plans to win a war against our Navy, this is important. Because obviously in dealing with China, our Navy really is the number one service that we have to deal with it, given its geographic position. And this is from the national interest. More than 20 years ago, a military confrontation in East Asia pushed the United States and China, uncomfortably close to conflict. Largely unknown in America, the event made a lasting impression on China, especially Chinese military planners. We just talked about this. The third Taiwan Crisis, as historians call it, was China's introduction to the power and flexibility of the aircraft carrier, something it obsesses about to this day. The crisis began in 1995. Taiwan's first ever democratic elections for president were set for 1996, a major event that Beijing naturally opposed. The sitting president, Lee Teng-hu, of the Kuomintang Party, was invited to the United States to speak at his alma mater, Cornell University. Lee was already disliked by Beijing for his emphasis on Taiwanization, which favored home rule and established a separate Taiwanese identity away from mainland China. Now he was being asked to speak at Cornell on Taiwan's democratization, and Beijing was furious. The Clinton administration was reluctant to grant Lee a visa. He'd been denied one for a similar talk at Cornell the year before, but near unanimous support from Congress forced the White House's hand. Lee was granted a visa and visited Cornell that June. Xinhua state news agency warned, "The issue of Taiwan is as explosive as a barrel of gunpowder. It is extremely dangerous to warm it up, no matter whether the warming is done by the United States or Li Tenghu. This wanton wound inflicted upon China will help the Chinese people more clearly realize what kind of a country the United States is." So in August 1995, China announced a series of missile exercises in the East China Sea. Although the exercises weren't unusual, their announcement was. And there was speculation that it was the beginning of an intimidation campaign by China, both as retaliation against the Cornell visit and intimidation of Taiwan's electorate ahead of the next year's election. The exercises involved the People's Liberation Army's 2nd Artillery Corps and the redeployment of Chinese F-7 fighters, that's their version of the MiG-21 or was, 250 miles from Taiwan. Also, in a move that would sound very familiar in 2017, up to 100 Chinese civilian fishing boats entered territorial waters around the Taiwanese island of Matsu, just off the coast of the mainland. According to globalsecurity.org, redeployments of Chinese long-range missile forces continued in 1996, and the Chinese military actually prepared for military action. China drew up contingency plans for 30 days of missile strikes against Taiwan, 1 strike a day, shortly after the March 1996 presidential elections. These strikes were not carried out, but preparations were likely detected by U.S. intelligence. In March 1996, China announced its 4th major military exercises since the Cornell visit. The country's military announced a series of missile test zones off the Chinese coastline, which also put the missiles in the approximate direction of Taiwan. In reality, China fired 3 missiles, 2 of which splashed down just 30 miles from the Taiwanese capital of Taipei, and 1 of which splashed down 35 miles from Kaohsiung. Together, the 2 cities handled most of the country's commercial shipping traffic. For an export-driven country like Taiwan, the missile launches seemed like an ominous shot across the country's economic bow. American forces were already operating in the area. The USS Bunker Hill, a Ticonderoga-class Aegis cruiser, was stationed off southern Taiwan to monitor China's missile tests with its Spy-1 radar system. The Japanese-based USS Independence, along with the destroyers Hewitt and O'Brien and frigate McCluskey, took up position on the eastern side of the island. Now, I'm going through this because I guarantee you're not hearing this anywhere else, so we have a full understanding of what China's up to, why they're up to it, and, and why we're not really prepared for it as a people. We're busy talking about Stormy Daniels, stuff like that, and this is very, very crucial information. And it's relevant today, not only because of what China's doing, but when we have a summit or a series of summits with North Korea, we must keep something in mind. China, at all times. So after the missile tests, the carrier USS Nimitz left the Persian Gulf region and raced back to the Western Pacific. This was an even more powerful carrier battle group consisting of the Aegis cruiser Port Royal, guided missile destroyers Oldendorf and Callaghan, guided missile frigate USS Ford, and a nuclear attack sub, the USS Portsmouth. Nimitz and its escorts took up station in the Philippine Sea, ready to assist independence. Contrary to popular belief, neither carrier actually entered the Taiwan Strait. The People's Liberation Army, unable to do anything about the American aircraft carriers, was utterly humiliated. China, which was just beginning to show the consequences of rapid economic expansion, still did not have a military capable of posing a credible threat to American ships just a short distance from its coastline. While we might never know the discussions that later took place, we know what has happened since. Just 2 years later, a Chinese businessman purchased the hulk of the unfinished Russian aircraft carrier Reagan, with the stated intention of turning it into a resort and casino. We know this ship today as China's first aircraft carrier, Lining, after it was transferred to the Chinese Navy and underwent a 15-year refurbishment. At least one carrier is under construction. They've already completed that now, as you saw. And the ultimate goal may be as many as 5 Chinese carriers. At the same time, the 2nd Artillery Corps leveraged its expertise in long-range rockets to create the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile. The DF-21 has obvious applications against large capital ships, such as aircraft carriers. And let me tell you, my other reading has told me that's the plan of the Chinese, to take out the aircraft carriers right off the bat, to take them out. And in a future crisis could force the U.S. Navy to operate 800 to 900 miles off Taiwan and the rest of the so-called first island chain. The third Taiwan crisis was a brutal lesson for a China that had long prepared to fight wars inside of its own borders. Still, the Chinese Navy deserves credit for learning from the incident, and now, 22 years later, it is quite possible that China could seriously damage or even sink an American carrier. Also, unlike the United States, China is in the unique position of both seeing the value of carriers and building its own fleet, while at the same time devoting a lot of time and resources to the subject of sinking them. The United States may soon find itself in the same position. It's very, very troublesome, very worrisome. So we must keep China in mind. I think China is the gravest military and economic threat we face in the United States. And so in our dealings with Korea or any other country, certainly in that region, we must always keep that as a prominent reminder of what we're doing, because we have a lot of time to make up here, given what we did to our military. You know, you have to wonder, you're President of the United States, you're the Commander-in-Chief, you see what China's doing, you see what Russia's doing, you see what North Korea's doing, you see what Iran's doing. You cut this outrageous deal with Iran that props up the government and empowers their military. You basically ignore what's going on in North Korea. You allow China to flex its muscles all over Asia. And of course, in the case of Russia, you're all about appeasing Russia. You know, wait till the election's over so we have more flexibility, that sort of stuff. And so that's what the president is up against. That's what he's trying to deal with. That's it.